Welcome to our lecture on sociology of media. Mass media refer to the print and electronic means of communication that carry messages to widespread audiences. Mass media are a product of what are called the cultural industries, or sometimes the creative industries. These are industries that combine the creation, production, and distribution of goods and services that are cultural in nature, everything from movies to podcasts to publishing, and usually protected by intellectual property rights. However, despite being called the creative industries, cultural industries aren't necessarily organized to generate creativity. Usually, instead of constantly developing new ideas, most large TV and movie studios, as well as publishing houses and other purveyors of cultural product, function more like assembly lines, reusing old storylines and stock characters because they've been successful in the past. The reason for this is simple. Content is expensive to produce, and the bigger the audience, the bigger the price tag. A pilot episode of a TV show costs around $3.5 million to make, whereas the average Hollywood film, according to The Economist in 2016, costs about $100 million to produce and market. Even big-budget commercials like the one aired during the Super Bowl can require over $5 million, including production costs and the cost of the slot itself. Because of this, producers often tend to be far more conservative than creative when pushing new scripts or storylines. This tendency was termed the logic of safety by media researcher Todd Gitlin. The logic of safety describes the tendency of producers to repackage the same ideas, themes, and formulas to minimize risk and maximize profit. This poster for 2007 action film Shoot 'Em Up gives us some idea of how that works, carefully highlighting all the things that tend to draw audiences: guns, violence, sexy half-naked women. The slow-motion jump scene, stark urban architecture, and Clive Owen's long black trench coat seem straight out of the Matrix series. The logic of safety promises that if something is popular in one film, pretty much every film after it will copy it. With that much money riding on the line, no one wants to take risks. One thing that helps to explain the prevalence of stereotypes in the media is the logic of safety. A stereotype is an unreliable generalization about all members of a group that does not recognize individual differences between members of that group. Stereotypes may persist in media content because stock or stereotype characters that were popular with audiences in the past tend to get recycled. This can create a frustrating conundrum for minority actors, like these shown in this meme, of Latino actors dressed as various stereotyped characters and holding a sign that says, "We'll stereotype for food." One of the most important things to remember when analyzing media critically is this. Mass media mostly exists to sell stuff to us. We tune in for the entertainment or the news content, but that isn't really what these outlets are for. Mass media, at least the kind that is seemingly free, that you don't need to pay to access, are largely funded by advertising, and the entertainment or news content is like the sugar coating to get us to swallow the pill, i.e., sit through the commercials. Because media content is changing, and media forms and outlets are also changing and evolving rapidly, advertisers have had to adapt to keep up, making it so you have to minimize several pop-up ads before you can get to the website you wanted to read, or embedding advertising into shows or movies through paid product placement, making sure the characters are drinking branded soft drinks or alcohol, making certain all labels are prominently displayed. The central role of advertising in funding so much of the media we consume tends to foster a phenomenon that French sociologist Jean Baudrillard called hyperconsumerism, or the practice of buying more than we need, want, or can realistically afford. People have certain basic needs: food, shelter, medical care, clothing, which is a kind of shelter, and advertisers compete to fill these needs, fighting over whose breakfast cereal or whose sneakers gets the biggest market share. But often the real key to get people to spend money on your product is in creating some new need, convincing people they have it, and then presenting them with your product, the only one qualified to fill it. Often this is done by preying on people's insecurities, and women can be a favorite target. In the United States, many light-skinned Caucasians seek a tanned look, but in many other parts of the world, where the majority of the population is darker-skinned, the emphasis is often on skin bleaching or whitening. Skin bleaches and lighteners are a $10 billion a year global industry, and they can be pretty caustic, burning or irritating the skin. Most are meant to be applied to the face and hands, but some, like this one, promise to make your armpits more beautiful by making them lighter. It's hard to imagine a lot of women were walking around in Thailand, Ecuador, or Bangladesh, worrying about whether their armpits were the right color, until some clever advertiser introduced the idea that they should be, and instantly provided a product that existed just to fill that particular and newly created need. Media in theory. Let's go back to the theoretical perspectives in sociology for a moment. Adherents to the interactionist perspective stress that people in social situations are constantly performing, like actors on a stage, except the role they're playing is themselves, or more specifically, one of a dozen different selves. The person we are for our friends, for strangers, for a new date, for an employer, and so on. We use symbol systems, our verbal and body language, our clothes, etc., as props to project the identities we have or want to have. And that is where media, specifically advertising, comes in. In a consumerist society like ours, advertising has taught us that what we buy is an important expression of who we are. 200 years ago, a person might have only had one pair of shoes, and their purpose was to protect their feet. Now a person may have dozens, and each one is supposed to project a different image for a different role, persona, or mood. Moreover, we are told that a person who wears Nikes is fundamentally different than a person who wears Vans or Chuck Taylors, and that our choice of brand or style is a way of determining which of those people we want to be. This is one of the ways that an interactionist would understand the role of media. He or she would look at how ads appeal to our need to both be seen as individuals and to belong to groups of other people by telling us we can buy our way into having both. He would also look at how people express identities through other media choices. The kind of music we listen to, for example, is a particular important marker of all kinds of things for people, especially teenagers and young adults, who often form friendship groups or even decide who they want to date based on whether they like the same bands or groups. Because we want to project positive images of ourselves, and because our society is one which values wealth, often treating people who are rich as fundamentally better, smarter, or more worthwhile than people who aren't, many of us purchase products with the express purpose of looking rich and successful. This creates a phenomenon sociologist Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption, the spending of money or display of wealth in order to achieve social status. It's why people spend thousands of dollars on Rolex watches when a $10 quartz crystal watch from Walmart keeps time just as well, or even more accurately, than an expensive mechanical one. The functionalist perspective, in turn, looks at how social institutions contribute to societal function and stability. Analyzing media, a functionalist would ask the question, what does this thing, what does media, do for society? How does it serve our communities or ensure social stability? Media has both important manifest functions, open or stated functions, and important latent functions, unconscious or unstated functions. Its manifest functions are obvious, to entertain and inform. Its latent functions are broader. It helps to socialize new members and enforces basic social norms. Media aimed at children show this in particular, frequently mixing in stories and songs with lessons about colors, letters, numbers, and expected behavior. Look both ways while crossing the street. Wear your seatbelt. Say please and thank you. Anyone who grew up watching children's cartoons is probably familiar with PSAs on drug use, like this 1991 paperback book in which the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles rapped about just saying no. Finally, media promote consumption. This could be seen either as its manifest function or its latent function, depending on your perspective. But in a capitalist society, this is a big one. Consumption is a key means by which wealth is generated and is considered a measure of overall economic strength. Again, the real purpose of media is delivering you to advertisers. That's how it's funded. The role of media in socializing us is the root of what media analysts Gerbner and Gross call cultivation theory. Cultivation theory argues that over time, media exposure will subtly cultivate or shape our perceptions of reality. This cultivation can have an impact even on light consumers of media, because the impact on heavy consumers has an impact on the culture as a whole. Storytelling is a fundamental part of human culture. We socialize and teach children through stories. Even as adults, one of the most effective ways to get a message across is to make a story out of it. Any expert on public speaking knows this. If you stand in front of a room full of people and say, "Let me tell you a story," the audience's body language immediately changes. They look up, shift forward, put down their pens and their smartphones. You have their attention. We love stories. They're how we learn. As George Gerbner said, the person who tells the stories in a culture has tremendous power to shape the culture's behavior. 100 years ago, our primary storytellers were our parents and other older people in our community, our clergy, and our teachers. Now, it's a handful of global media conglomerates who are primarily driven by a motivation to make money. Human beings are still complex creatures with intelligent minds and free will, so no one is arguing that we immediately go out and do whatever our TV tells us to. Rather, Gerbner and Gross argue, media's power comes from its ability to frame normality and reality and to define common sense. Any individual experiences only a small segment of the world directly, but most of us think we know what life is like living in a ghetto or in a prison, or what it's like to work in a hospital ER or a top law firm. In reality, we've only ever experienced those places through TV and movies, of course. Media also subtly shape our ideas about other things. They tell us what beauty is, what success looks like, what true love is, and we often subconsciously find ourselves measuring our own selves and our own experiences against those ideals. For generations, researchers have been interested in the role that media violence plays in shaping our behavior. American media is pretty violent, and it's been getting more so over time. Violence in films has more than doubled since 1950, and gun violence in PG-13 rated films has tripled since 1985, according to the American Association of Pediatrics. Children who play first-person shooter games like Halo or Fallout may commit thousands of digital murders every year. Does exposure to violence make us more likely to commit violence? Most of us would assume yes, but surprisingly, the evidence on this is mixed. Experiments show some increase in aggressive behavior among children immediately after the viewing of violent media or playing a violent video game, but the evidence of a long-lasting effect is weaker. However, one way that violent media do seem to affect us is by framing our idea about what the real world is like. Research on the role of violent media suggests that the more violent media we consume, the more we tend to fall prey to something called mean world syndrome. Our actual odds of becoming a victim of a violent crime are only about 1% each year. But the more TV we watch, the more likely we are to drastically overstate those odds. Research by Nabi and Sullivan in 2001 found that the volume of television viewing directly correlated both to how much crime subjects believed was out there and to their self-reported protective measures, things like locking their doors when home, not leaving windows open, carrying pepper spray or a weapon, etc. One thing that helps to explain mean world syndrome is that news media, especially local news, is heavily focused on crime. In an average broadcast, anywhere between 30 to 50% of airtime will be devoted to crime stories. Sometimes, when news covers some new social problem or crime trend, it goes overboard, and the coverage turns into what we might call a moral panic. Moral panic describes a feeling of fear spread among a large number of people that some new deviant or criminal group or behavior threatens the well-being of society. The threat may be real, or it might be an urban legend, basically a made-up story, but generally the fear or attention it generates is highly overblown. When you were growing up, you may have heard stories about children who died from eating poisoned Halloween candy, or candy or apples with razor blades hidden in them. Maybe this impacted your experience of Halloween. Some American children talk about not being allowed to go trick-or-treating at all, or having their parents go through their candy before they were allowed to eat it, pulling little candy bars apart, looking for hypodermic needles. Stories about children who had died or been maimed from being given poisoned or otherwise weaponized Halloween candy while trick-or-treating began to gain popularity in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. Supposedly, there was this new sick and twisted crime on the rise, where random sociopaths all over the country were killing little kids by giving out poisoned treats to trick-or-treaters. News media covered it extensively, and some towns even shut down trick-or-treating as a result. Did it ever happen? Was it a trend? How many kids actually died from eating poisoned Halloween candy? To our knowledge, there was only one, and he didn't get it from a stranger while trick-or-treating. On Halloween in 1974, an 8-year-old boy named Timothy O'Brien died. His candy had indeed been poisoned, but it hadn't been by a stranger. A few days prior, his own father, a man named Ronald Clark O'Brien, had taken out a $40,000 life insurance policy on Timothy and his sister Elizabeth as a way to get out of debt. The only way to collect the money required that at least one of his children die, so the elder O'Brien laced some Pixie Stix candy with cyanide and cajoled his son into eating one before bed. When the death was investigated, he tried to claim the boy had gotten the poison candy from trick-or-treating at another house. Timothy O'Brien's story is a terrible one, but the idea that thousands or more of people were actively trying to prey on little kids by giving them poison candy, which spawned a moral panic and completely changed the geography of Halloween for generations of American children, that was simply never true. Another way that news media coverage can become dysfunctional and misinform people instead of informing them comes in the form of fake or hoax news. This is defined as false information presented to look like a credible, albeit very sensationalistic news story. The intent of fake news can be varied. It might be to produce so-called clickbait, to take viewers to a site where they would be exposed to ads or malware, for example. It could be to play a hoax or just make a joke, or in some cases the intent is to spread deliberate misinformation aimed at harming a person or organization. That final use of fake news became a big deal after the 2016 presidential campaign because there were allegations that the campaign itself was marred by alleged foreign influence in the form of organized fake news campaigns. Russia, in particular, was accused of paying an army of posters and hackers, mostly located in Eastern Europe, to write and circulate stories aimed at both fueling social upheaval in the United States and discrediting Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, whose foreign policy platform would have been likely more hostile to Russian interests than that of GOP candidate Donald Trump. So-called bots, or computer programs, also disseminated links to false news stories through Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms. These stories accused Clinton in particular of heinous but untrue crimes ranging from murder to Satanism. One of the worst culminated in the so-called Pizzagate scandal, which began with a fake news story accusing Clinton, then Democratic National Committee Chairman John Podesta, and the owner of a seemingly random Washington, D.C. pizza place, Comet Ping Pong Pizza, of being part of a child sex trafficking ring. The story was circulated on right-wing conspiracy sites for months before the election. Trump's national security advisor, Michael Flynn, also tweeted a story about it. This particular story was debunked over and over again in legitimate news sources, but the thing about conspiracy theorists is, the more you try to disprove something, the more they see that as evidence of a cover-up. In this case, the whole situation almost turned violent when, in December of 2016, a man from Salisbury, North Carolina, having read online that the pizza restaurant was harboring young children who were being used by Clinton and Podesta as sex slaves, decided to load up his pickup truck with guns, drive to Washington, D.C., and free them. He drove about 6 hours from his home to the restaurant to see the situation for himself, according to court documents, arrived at the pizzeria, walked in armed with an AR-15 type rifle, and fired several shots, injuring no one, but frightening a lot of random families who had simply come for lunch. Paradoxically, at the same time that media can perform dysfunctionally by whipping up crises that don't really exist, it can sometimes do the opposite, creating what's called narcotizing dysfunction. This happens when viewers are bombarded with so many tragic and frightening stories, they eventually become fatigued and desensitized. They get burned out and lose the ability to care. News media love to cover tragedies, crimes, and new public health threats, because at first these things get us to tune in. If it bleeds, it leads, is the slogan in journalism. But over time, we can only pay attention to any one given threat for so long. Basically, we get overwhelmed and lose the ability to care. When that happens, media coverage leads to viewer inactivity rather than action or activism. This brings us back to the third in our big three sociological perspectives, conflict perspective. Again, conflict perspective argues two things. One, that human behavior is driven by struggles between groups over resources, and two, that privileged groups will structure social institutions to maintain their dominant position. How does a member of conflict perspective understand media? Well, from the perspective of a conflict theorist, media is ideally suited to structuring social institutions to maintain the dominant position of people who are already in charge, because it plays such a strong role in socializing us. Mass media, a conflict theorist would argue, does not function as a platform where diverse members of society can express multiple viewpoints. Rather, it is more likely to function as a means of expressing the dominant ideology, a set of cultural beliefs and practices that help to maintain powerful social, economic, and political interests. This is basically the point of view of the people in charge, according to the conflict theorist, and would tend to emphasize the message that the current way of things is the best one, and we should all just go along with it. It is true that mass media are produced by a very small segment of the population. These people tend to be relatively socially privileged, and they exert a great deal of control over what eventually reaches the audience, a phenomenon known as gatekeeping. Because of this, the biases and viewpoints of this particular group of producers, advertisers, publishing houses, and studio executives will ultimately tend to shape what goes on the air. Independent media is a little bit different. It is produced by a less influential, more diverse group of content creators, but it also doesn't have the same ability to reach the kind of large audiences that a Hollywood movie, for example, can, because it doesn't have the resources to market and distribute on that scale. So now, as in the past, most of the media that we consume is produced by a relatively small segment of the population, and one that doesn't necessarily reflect the diversity of the American or global public. And this can cause media to present a skewed version of reality. We see this even in news media, which is supposed to present us with the unbiased truth about current events and social issues. Nevertheless, research on the portrayal of minorities in news media, for example, show a different story than is presented by reality. For example, minorities tend to be overrepresented as the perpetrators and underrepresented as victims in TV news crime coverage. A study conducting analysis of local news found that blacks were portrayed as suspects or perpetrators in 69% of major crime stories in one TV market, despite constituting only 31% of all arrestees. Whites, in contrast, were portrayed as perpetrators and suspects in only 31% of local news major crime stories, although they made up 61% of local arrestees. National news media platforms, according to a study conducted by Dixon in 2017, tended to overrepresent blacks as criminals by 11 percentage points compared to arrest records, and underrepresent whites as criminals by 39 percentage points when compared to the same records of arrests. Not only are black suspects of crime overrepresented in local news crime coverage, but they are also presented in subtly different ways that may serve to bias audiences about their guilt, innocence, or potential dangerousness. For example, in a study conducted in 2000 by Antman and Rojecki, they found that regardless of the severity of the crime, a mugshot of a black defendant was 4 times more likely to appear in a local television news report than a mugshot of a white defendant. Black defendants were twice as likely to be shown being physically restrained in local television news reports than white defendants, and the name of the accused was twice as likely to be shown on screen in a local TV news report if the defendant was black rather than white. Not only are minorities overrepresented as suspects or perpetrators, they tend to be underrepresented as victims. An analysis conducted by Dixon and Linz of news programming in LA, which looked at coverage specifically of homicides, compared the real-life victimization rate and the TV victimization rate of victims of different races. While only 13% of all murder victims in LA County during the period of study were white murder victims accounted for 43% of murder victims portrayed on the local news. 28% of murder victims were black, but black murder victims only got about 23% of stories about in local news coverage. Latinos were the most underrepresented at all, constituting 54% of all murder victims in real life, but only 19% of those whose stories got news coverage. From a conflict perspective, this may be evidence of a conscious or unconscious tendency on the part of station managers, who themselves tend to be white, to value the lives of people like themselves more highly than those of other groups. Entertainment media isn't necessarily better. A study by Stacy Smith and her colleagues at the USC Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism found that across film and broadcast, cable, and streaming TV, minorities still constitute only about 28.3% of all speaking roles, though they make up nearly 40% of the U.S. population as of the most recent census. The most underrepresented groups tended to be Asians, Latinos, and Native Americans, while representations of blacks have tended to improve, at least in total number, over the past couple decades, due in large part to decades of advocacy aimed at pressuring content creators to create more diverse casts. Women suffer a similar kind of underrepresentation, making up only 33.5% of all speaking roles. Women across platforms also tend to be less likely to be cast in leading roles, are more likely to be portrayed in heavily sexualized ways, and are more likely to be very young. Only 25.7% of female characters were over the age of 40 versus 74.3% of male characters. One reason for this may simply be that media creators themselves still tend to be heavily white and male. Only 15% of film and TV directors and 28% of film and TV writers were women, according to Smith et al. Less than 16% of TV and film directors are members of minority racial and ethnic groups. The same lack of diversity can be found in news media, too. A study done by Papper in 2010 found that minorities made up only about 20% of TV news staff and only about 5% of radio news staffs, whereas women made up 21.2%. These kinds of biases can have impacts on viewers. For example, in a one-year longitudinal study, television viewing predicted a decrease in self-esteem for pre-adolescent white girls, and black boys, but an increase in self-esteem for white boys. Meaning TV viewing was negatively correlated with self-esteem, but only among certain groups of children. This is likely because white boys still tend to see more and more positive images of people like themselves than do girls or children of color. Viewing stereotyped images can influence our perceptions in other ways as well. Psychologists talk about something called confirmation bias, which describes the tendency to seek out and remember information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. This has to do with the way we process information cognitively. We are constantly bombarded with information, and our brains have to deal with all of it. Often, they take a shortcut by selectively noticing and remembering information that already confirms something we know to be true, or think we know to be true, and ignoring whatever contradicts it. When that happens, we call it confirmation bias. Sometimes our brains will even change or reinterpret information that contradicts something we believe to make it fit instead. In the 1970s, Cornell University psychologist Sandra Bem did a study where she showed small children pictures of little boys baking cookies and little girls boxing. She sent the kids home and then brought them back into her lab the next day and asked them what they'd looked at. All the children confidently reported that they'd seen pictures of little girls baking cookies and little boys boxing, even though they'd seen the opposite. The children's brains, already certain that little girls didn't box and little boys didn't bake cookies, just edited out what they'd seen so it fit with their stereotypes about gender. Adults do this too. If someone is prejudiced about members of a particular race, that person will immediately forget every instance when they saw a member of that race behaving well, and remember clearly every time they saw one behaving badly. People can change their biases, but since they will tend to initially ignore information that contradicts those biases, they generally need to be bombarded with a lot of counter-stereotypical information. They also need to have a basic willingness to engage with it. Media can either help with this process by presenting a more inclusive and non-stereotypical vision of the world, or it can hinder it by doing the opposite. Often, unfortunately, it does the second. Finally, and one important thing to always remember, is that while mass media may shape our vision of the social world, it doesn't control it. Audiences still ultimately determine what to make of the messages they consume. We call this tension the distinction between encoding and decoding. Encoding, according to social theorist Stuart Hall, refers to the intended meaning of a media text, and decoding refers to the process by which people actively and creatively interpret that text. All media consumption shows this process, and there are lots of examples. The writers, directors, and producers of a film may think they're making a horror movie, but audiences might decide to treat it as a comedy instead. Actually, 2014 horror film Zombievers was probably always supposed to be funny, but you get the idea. Movies and TV shows about war, like Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Saving Private Ryan, or even the long-running TV drama MASH, often originally set out with the intention of being anti-war and anti-military by trying to demonstrate just how brutal and senseless war is. But inevitably, some young audience members viewed them differently, interpreting the life and death struggles on screen as adventurous and heroic, and deciding to join the military themselves in search of their own war experiences. The encoded message, war is hell, was ultimately replaced by a totally different decoded one, war is exciting. This concludes our lecture on the sociology of media. Thank you for listening.